And then I'll shift to English because we have a wonderful international host today. Welcome, Teresa. Very nice to see you here online. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the Netherlands, and it's 9 o'clock, you just told me, in Minnesota. That's where you are from. So I hope you had
Yep,
your coffee yet and had your caffeine yet to start this. And for
working
all
on
of
it.
our very well, very well. And for all of our guests, Teresa is a licensed psychologist in a private practice in Plymouth, Minnesota, and she is specialized, among other things, in assessment of gifted children, as well as interventions with families and children. And her clinical work focuses on helping children, adults, and families to find solutions in their real world situations. And in addition to this work, she consults with schools on establishing educational plans for gifted children. So, a lot of experience where we can learn from here in the Netherlands. She's also the former president of the Minnesota Council for the Gifted and Talented and has spent many years working with families on educational choices and on emotional health for children and adults. And she's going to tell us something about anxiety in gifted children. And you may also know Teresa from her chapter about anxiety in gifted children in the book Understanding Twice Exceptional Learners, which was published at Routledge. And maybe something you don't know yet, she finds rest in nature, I heard. And she loves to paint, and she paints wonderful mountains. So that's also very talented, in my opinion. And we are very grateful to have you in this webinar, Teresa, this afternoon to tell us about anxiety and stress and gifted children. So good morning to you, and the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry I'm a little dark. It is bright sunlight here in Minnesota today, and I have my drapes. I face a window, and I have my drapes slightly closed. So mostly you'll be focusing on the slide deck, so it will be fine. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So here's how the day is going to flow, or the 2 hours that we have together. We'll have some opportunity for you to interact in the chat. Hopefully you are a chatty group in by your mouth also, and we'll give some opportunity to have some dialogue with each other as we're going along and talking about anxiety, gifted children, stress, and things in our world. You will have access to this slide deck. It's been provided and will be sent to you if you don't already have it. So thank you. I'm excited that we have as many psychologists and other counselors and teachers and who are with us today. So we are 1 week from the election in Minnesota, so I will tell you my brain feels a little bit like this. The stress in the United States has been high. We're all managing and we're all thinking about how to approach the world, but just know that is a truth in my environmental state right now. So this is a lovely view from Northeast Minnesota. And so while you're looking at this, I invite you to put in the chat, when you think about anxiety, what words come to mind? So what do you think about? What words do anxiety trigger in your mind? And either you've come with it today thinking about a particular person or a classroom or an experience or yourself or a family member. So just throw in the chat some words that anxiety mean to you. And while you are doing that, I'm not seeing very many yet. Worry, stress, Inside Out 2, lovely movie. Yes. Anxiety. That was a hyper form of anxiety that we watched in Inside Out 2. The unknown, fear, helplessness, problems with children. And that's what our slant is today, for sure, as we're talking about anxiety. Failure and pressure, that's going to fall into some of the conversations we're having about gifted and how anxiety fills their world. Oh, time. I think that's true of all of us. As the older we get, the more time creates anxiety for us. So good words. Here's some other words that have come up at other times for people as they think about anxiety. And so we all have different views, and that we're going to talk a little bit about that when you think about responding and being the person who is responsible for supporting people in stress and anxiety, because there are so many different views of what has just happened and how the body responds to it, and then what we need to do in response to that. So it's not a very clear-cut situation or emotion or feeling. So just so we all start on the same place, anxiety is an emotion, and fear is an appropriate short-lived response, right? So when we talk about those two things, and we're going to try and differentiate a little bit from that today for you, because the emotional or the thinking part of anxiety and the fear lead to different responses in different people. Anxiety disorder is when that excessive fear or anxiety is out of proportion to the situation. So it either lasts a lot longer or it's bigger than what would be a typical response. And you can think about a phobia as being an out of proportion response to a specific thing, like I'm scared of bees, or a worry anxiety being I respond with worry about things that a brain that's not in an anxiety response would perceive as normal. So we have all different kinds of ways of talking about anxiety. There are all different types of anxiety disorder. I'm not actually going to go into the types because you guys aren't psychologists. You're educators. Some of you, I guess, are psychologists. You already know the different types of anxiety. So we're going to focus more on understanding from a big picture, and then what do we do as we move through the day. So one of the things to remember when we think about this anxiety and fear is anxiety is a top-down experience in the brain. So it comes from think of it more from the top of the brain, the thinking response to some kind of perceived threat, but it's not maybe a threat that we can actually know in the world. It's not right in front of us. Fear is a bottom up, it's the amygdala limbic system reaction to something that is a known external danger, and that is the amygdala response. You can loop those things. You can start from a top down. I have a fear, anxiety about something that is like that nagging feeling that you might have about getting in a car and driving. That feels like there's a threat when you're a first driver. And then that can turn into an amygdala response if you get into a situation where you are like caught suddenly in a tough situation and your amygdala fires in a driving experience. And so now we can loop and increase an anxiety and fear response together. They also can happen separate. And so that's something to be aware of when you're someone who is thinking about and responding to someone in front of you that feels like they're in a stress or anxiety or fear moment. That sometimes they start from different places, and that might mean that we take a different look of how to intervene and how to step in as someone who's watching that happen. Sometimes we're making guesses. Was this a top down or a bottom up? Sometimes we know because we can have someone express to us, I'm afraid of that upcoming math test, which is not a real actual threat to their being, but they perceive it as a threat. Or you put a math test in front of a kid and they have a like panic, fear, the amygdala went off. I've now looped it into an actual amygdala response to something that's not an actual threat. And you can think about this loop also like snakes are a great one. Sometimes we have anxiety about snakes. Sometimes we have fear about snakes because a snake just went in front of us in the path. And that's such a deep biological fear response that it can develop into that top-down perceived threat of snakes, even if a gardener snake is not really going to harm you. Okay. So anxiety looks all different kinds of ways. This is what we're going to be kind of sorting through today. All of these different things happen, both physiological and cognitive, and then sometimes it's also behavior, like needing reassurance, that kind of constantly coming up and saying, am I okay? Am I okay? Am I okay? That's an anxiety behavior. Lack of patience when we feel time is a stress and we've got to get in there quickly. That is the perceived threat that time is going to somehow hit. me in a way that's going to capture me, and I'm not going to be able to do whatever it is that I need to do. So these are all different ways that our body, our mind, and then our behavior respond to anxiety in the world. And I just put that in there so that you can recognize maybe little bits and pieces as you are thinking about the anxiety person or classroom or experience that for you. So why do we talk about anxiety? Like, why was this something that Eleanor said, hey, I think we should have a conversation from a perspective of what's happening in the United States about anxiety. So here's a little bit of anxiety data from the United States. So our National Institute of Mental Health has identified that 38% of girls and 26% of boys have experienced an anxiety disorder. So we go back to that definition. That's the prolonged or exaggerated response of anxiety that stays. Anxiety looks a lot and is interwoven into many other things like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities. And one of the things that we as educators are sometimes trying to figure out when we're looking at multiple things happening is what takes the lead. So you have a kiddo who has ADHD. Do they then give you an anxiety response because their ADHD made it really difficult to respond in that environment that they were in? Or did their anxiety come and make the focus and attention even harder? And the anxiety is pushing the ADHD to be worse than it actually is. So they can interweave together. And one of our jobs when we are looking at responses is, can we identify a lead and respond to the lead thing that's presenting in front of us? And if it's anxiety, sometimes that can then lead to being able to push down some of the other symptoms that might be a secondary or an additional diagnosis like ADHD. So thinking about it from what is presenting in front of me is important with anxiety because it is so interwoven in these other things. We definitely saw a rise of anxiety during the pandemic, at least in the United States. I'm assuming in Netherlands. I'm assuming that you all had the same experience that everybody else had, which is we are in an uncomfortable lack of control and lack of predictability. And lack of control and lack of predictability are two of the main things that makes anxiety rise in most people. So of course, the pandemic led to that. The other thing that we're talking about a lot in the United States is Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And his main premise of this book is that we've had a significant rise in anxiety in many countries since the introduction of social media and smartphones, which happened to be sometime between 2008 and 2010, depending on what country you're in. So this is a chart from his book. And you can see from 2008 to about 2012, all these different age areas, we did not have a significant increase until about 2012 to 2014. You start to see those creep up as far as percentage of people who are identified with anxiety disorders. Now, his main view of this, and we're going to stop and let you all have a little discussion, or all of us together, a little discussion, is that it's because the brain, particularly before age 16 is kind of his cutoff, but it's, as I read, somewhere 11, 12, 13, is not prepared for what will happen with a phone-based experience rather than a play-based experience. So a play-based childhood is one where we are going out into the world and interacting and connecting with people in a one-on-one, in real life, interactive way. A phone-based world is where we're interacting with people mostly through asynchronous. You're on your social media, you say something, and there's not an immediate response. There's a delay, there's a time span, there's a opportunity to raise your anxiety because is anyone going to respond to what I put out there on my Snapchat or my Instagram or my whatever? And that delay of response is part of what adds to the anxiety of social media and phone-based world. It's also the lack of time and interaction with others in real life situations where we are solving problems in the moment. And then we add on there kind of the perfect world that the social media presents to us, and that the brain before age 16 has a very difficult time. My brain at age 56 has a very difficult time of looking at social media and going, oh yeah, they only show the pictures that their filter made them look that way, right? Because I don't use filters, so it doesn't even occur to me. So all of those things, from hate and some others whose research is citing, have led to this increased anxiety. So I would love for us to take a moment and respond to this kind of thought where you guys are in the Netherlands, and please unmute and let's have a little bit of a dialogue. So what do you think? How do you respond to hate's belief that when we move from a play-based society to a phone-based society, we ended up overprotecting our children from the real world? And I didn't explain that very, very well, and I will if someone has questions, while underprotecting them in the virtual world. So unmute, let's have a short discussion. Do we have any brave souls? Go ahead. I can't see your name. I saw people. Okay, go ahead and talk, because I can't really see names well.
Patricia?
Ah. um, well, I think I believe the same. I'll see lots of children. I work in a primary school system, and I'll see lots of children who have not learned to overcome little things that don't go their way, for instance, and yeah, especially that part, because I don't know much about what they do in the virtual worlds. I don't have a good sight on that.
Right.
Because
And I think there's, yeah, for primary, there's two things. There's the virtual world, and at least in the United States, I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but what we have moved from a society is that 1950s, 1960s, most of children's play was with other children, and they were sorting through as they were doing their early play, right? And there was a lot of negotiating, and you hurt my feelings, and now can we still play? At least in the United States, much of the children's early development is with a coach or a teacher or an adult. And so it's the coach or the teacher or the adult that is solving problems rather than kids on kids. And so I think they're coming to primary school without that. And then now we're adding the phone-based as they get older onto it. So you're exactly right, at least from
yes,
the United States perspective.
I think that I see something else. That is that as soon as children are impatient, or they are fighting with each other in a family situation, that parents see it as a normal solution to give them a device so they can play a video game or something, and they don't learn how to solve their problems by their own.
That
and it
back and
also
forth
means
interaction.
that the parents are sometimes absent because they are just on their device and are not looking after the children. So
Yeah.
there are many things have changed since.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and since 2008, 2010. Yeah, and at least in the United States, they have done conversations with kids, and kids are saying, I wish my parents would put down their phones. Right? I wish they would talk with me. I wish they would interact with me.
Yeah, I see some more faces now, so I'm not sure whether they want to react or they just want to show themselves. Me, you want to react?
Well, for me, it was a bit of a surprising idea. I have seen, of course, that the ideal world that is visible in social media brings a lot of fear and anxiety, but also indeed the idea that dealing with the virtual world with social media also makes that you can more easily worry about what will they be thinking about me, and in playing directly you will have feedback immediately.
Right. And that's why they check their phone so frequently.
Yeah,
right?
I can imagine that.
Did I get feedback? Did I get feedback?
Yeah.
Does anyone care? Does anyone care?
Yeah.
It's
a helpful thought. I've never looked at it this way.
Yeah. Yeah. One more, if there is one more, and then we'll keep moving. And people can dump things in the chat too. I don't want to cut off conversation, but I have about 3 hours of content. So
Yeah, I have an addition. Maybe what I was thinking on this topic, from phone-based, play-based to phone-based, what children also lack in this actual society is the physical connection with that comes with playing together. In a play-based society, you're physically there, and you are moving, and you're seeing cues. We just talked about cues before we started the webinar. You miss these social cues and these physical cues, and that might be a problem as well. Is that what you think too?
yeah, so it's cueing, and it's also in real life, we solve problems differently. And one of the things that has happened for children, again, this is the overprotecting children in the real world part of what Jonathan's talked about, and other people in the United States. We have cleansed our playgrounds of any problems and made them as safe as possible for kids. And so there is a movement in the United States to bring back like playgrounds with tires and boards and hammers and nails and building, and so that there is a problem solution experience as these kids are working together to come into situations, rather than if you go play, you should not come back with any kind of struggle or skin knee even, right? And so that's the overprotecting children in the real world. And I think it all plays together, right? Like in our attempt to make our kids safe, have we overlooked what happens when they have to overcome? And that we'll talk about that, like resilience. Resilience is overcoming stress. Like that's how you build resilience. And so if we're not letting them overcome stress, we're not letting them build that. Okay, thank you. I'm glad that we have some people who talk. It's always a concern when you are like just speaking to a screen. You hope that there'll be people who want to engage. So we'll have a couple other opportunities. All right, I'm going to move into some of the research on anxiety and giftedness. And let me start by saying that to some, research is very new, right? And to some degree, like all research, it's mixed. Here are the kind of like 4 areas that we know that the research says, yes, there might be a lean into some stress anxiety responses in gifted kids in comparison with neurotypical kids. One found that kids at highly competitive high schools are perceived at higher risk for behavioral and mental health. So these are like high level college prep, pressures on kind of high schools in the United States. One study, and this would be very consistent with the kids I see in my clinical work, shows that gifted students have higher levels of rumination. So rumination is kind of persistent worry, that push of like, I'm always thinking about the possibility of something going wrong, and that they have higher levels of stress. I have put this, and this comes from a kid I work with, in the idea that gifted brains have unrelenting forethought. So this comes from a 4th grade student I was working with, that we were talking about anxiety. We were talking about stress. He had been identified with anxiety disorder, and the fact that he just is constantly, what's next, what's next, what's next, what's next. And he came back to me and said, I don't have anxiety. I have unrelenting forethought. And I went, oh, yeah, so do most of the gifted kids I work with and the gifted people I work with. Their brain has a hard time shutting off from the what's next, what's happening. That's very consistent with what we see as an anxiety worry flow or a worry tape that goes on. So to me, that lands smack dab in the middle of, yep, I see anxiety with gifted as a coming together, maybe more so than others who are looking for very strict research criteria. Test anxiety is higher in students in full-time gifted classrooms. Again, this makes sense because of those full-time classrooms. We have narrowed the curve, right? We've put kids at that top 5 to 10% of the curve. And now my competition is fierce. And I'm not guaranteed to be at the top. And so the anxiety goes up in those situations when they get into a test situation. Again, makes sense to me. And there's some correlation between higher intensity and fear of the unknown, fear of insomnia, fear of death anxiety among gifted versus non-gifted. So the more a kid has intensity, the more we might see some anxiety. They just found these areas. I'm going to talk briefly on intensity because to me, in my work, in my office, intensity and anxiety and giftedness is just a like intertwined a little ball of messed up thread. It all winds in there together. There's also studies that show no difference in levels of anxiety between gifted and non-gifted students. Like for sure, there's studies out there that go, nope, they're no different than other, but they're no less than others. And I like to remind people who work with gifted kiddos, there is not really a protective factor. And I'm going to click to the next slide because there's the University of Iowa did find that the higher your IQ is, the more your anxiety scale tends to go down. So they would say maybe there's a protective factor as you get in a higher IQ. However, they found that if you had autism spectrum disorder and a high IQ, your anxiety scale would go up. So there was some of that combination. And the University of Iowa Bell and Blank Center, if you haven't looked at their research, is doing exceptional work on twice exceptional. They're doing lots of brain scans. They're doing lots of like brain mapping and trying to identify really, can we pull apart gifted and ASD and some of these other characteristics that go along with our like confusing picture of gifted people today, because there feels like that overlap with ASD is an interesting place to be. And of course, autism spectrum disorder has its own anxiety that happens with it. So maybe there's a protective factor. My belief in my practice is that it doesn't matter if I've got a kid with anxiety who's gifted who walks into my practice, the protective factor wasn't there for them. And so I want to be able to respond to their situation. Okay, so when we look at it, then I really see 4 areas where being gifted may make you a little bit more vulnerable or prone to anxiety. So we're going to briefly go through these 4. And then we'll have some time for some discussion. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we can stop and answer questions along the way if that's necessary. So the first kind of vulnerability is this asynchrony that goes along with giftedness. So asynchrony, if you remember, is being out of sync with what's expected. So if you look at this graph, like the through line is a 7-year-old. And if we have a neurotypical across physical, cognitive, social, and emotional, you kind of are within the bandwidth of what a typical 7-year-old looks like. If you move to the middle, that's moderately gifted kiddos. Now we have a heightened cognitive ability. The social can go, and the emotional, because social is how we interact with others, right? Emotional is how we perceive what's going on inside ourselves, has a width from the top of our cognitive to the bottom of what I will call the disintegration moments, the emotional disturbances, right? And so you have a broad band of possible social and emotional responses. And the third clump, the more gifted you get, the broader the band is in that asynchrony. So now we have a heightened cognitive ability, but I have lots of wide emotional responses and social capabilities that are all in that one little body. And that asynchrony might make it more vulnerable that you could respond because, and some of this winds into outcome expectations and other things, because you just have a wide range of responses that you're having. I'm just going to remind you about cognitive asynchrony. Like gifted kids are not just bright across the board in verbal, quantitative, and visual spatial. They might be high in some, low in others. They have asynchrony within that. I think this also can lead to anxiety, because if you've got a kiddo who is super smart in math and writing is kind of at the average level, Now we have this discrepancy, and there's some reasons for that. But we also have the frustration of people going, if you can do that, why can't you do that? What is wrong with you? Right? And now we've got this internal disturbance of some of it comes easy, some of it comes hard. What is this? And trying to cope with all of that asynchrony within their little bodies can cause a lot of stress and an anxiety response. Okay. Perfectionism is the second area within gifted that leads them to vulnerability for anxiety and stress. So perfectionism, as we're looking at it right now, is high standards and thriving for flawlessness with criticism. So if you have high standards and you're striving for excellence and you don't make it, and you're like, okay, that was all right. Sometimes we don't make it. You might not fall into that like negative perfectionism moment or experience that is unhealthy from our view of the world. It's the both of them coming together that leads to that perfectionistic response. For gifted people, one of our struggles is that particularly when we're young, if you go back to that asynchrony, my brain as a 7-year-old thinks like a 9, 10, 11-year-old. So of course I have high standards. When I think about doing something, I think about it like a 9, 10, or 11-year-old might think about it. The reality of our hands and our mouth most of the time is that they're 7. And so we develop this difficulty of like, my brain sees this and I can't make it happen. And so what does that look like from the outside world? Is that perfectionism? Is that just frustration? Do I develop a perfectionistic tendency because I keep seeing these high standards? And then I struggle because my brain, my hands and my mouth won't produce them. So I think gifted kids are particularly vulnerable to a perfectionistic response. Again, the research is mixed of whether they actually are or aren't. But most of them that we see in that struggle moment, that difference is one of the realities. I don't have this in a slide, but one of the things that I will tell you, because we're not going to talk about perfectionism today, but one of the things I will tell you is that helping a perfectionistic kid might mean that you make sure that you not only give the hi, hey, I see what your 9-year-old brain is doing, and you're 7, that feels 9. Here's what a 7-year-old has given me. Where do you want to be in the middle of that? Because you don't always have to be at the top. So we have to give them both the highest expectation, like we normally do, and the middle of the road, because it's a possibility that they don't see that 7-year-old. They only see the perfectionistic response. So when you're giving modeling, make sure you give both. And that actually kind of is my next slide. And that's how outcome expectations impact anxiety for gifted kids. So our expectation is you're gifted so. And what does that do for our children if the only message they hear is you're gifted so you should be giving me, if we think about the hamburger model of writing, you should be giving me a Big Mac every time you're writing something. And when you give me just a plain old hamburger that's just top, body, and conclusion, you're not living up to your potential. But now what have we done? We've set up a difficulty of them understanding that sometimes is not all the time. So we have to really work on our outcome expectations to not always be a gifted expectation, but sometimes be what is the reality of this moment in time of what I can give you. Okay, we're going to stop right there, just making sure there's no questions or no, before I jump into intensities. I'm looking, I don't see any.
Yeah, I do
Any
have
questions?
a question
Yeah.
though.
Yeah.
How do you, what's your viewpoint according to expectations when we look at gifted children who are from under represented groups, for example? And then we often say in the Netherlands, we should have high expectations of all of our students and all of the people, and not think, oh, they're from a lower social economical income or something. So how do you look at that? If you say we don't have to have these high expectations all the time, how does it relate to this topic and this problem with underrepresented groups?
Right. And underrepresented groups is like international problem, right? Not just Netherlands, everywhere. And the struggle is in that, I think, is if we say, I'm going to expect this of you, believing that you've had all of these experience underneath you to hold up that you can give me this, without confirming. So one of the things that we are working on in the United States is backloading education for these gifted kids, making sure that they are reading the amount of books, exposure to the amount of things. Because if we come up here and there's empty space below what we ask them to do, they'll never make it. Right. And so what we really have to look at with underrepresented population is not avoiding high expectations, but have we built the scaffold? Have we built the underlay? Have we given the foundation before we do too many high expectations? Or if we don't have time to build all of it, are we scaffolding it all the way up until we get there? Right. So a great example for most gifted kids is writing, right? They have huge ideas, and their writing is based on their physical age of their hand, right? It's not really based on their gifted brain. It's the physical age of their hand. And so do we expect them to write, short novellas by hand? No. But given another opportunity, do we scaffold and say, okay, for this kid, because the ideas are there and I want to at least capture the ideas, do I give them 15 minutes and I just type for 15 minutes to let idea flow happen, right? So how are we scaffolding? But if we come high and the underneath is empty, it's not going to work. That would be my, like, from a psychologist standpoint, view of it all.
Yes, thank you. It's very helpful. Yeah. And are there any other questions? Don't think so.
All right. I'm going to jump into intensity. I'm going to do a very fast, very furious run through intensity. Emotional intensity is the one that applies most to anxiety, but I'm going to talk about all five. And I'm going to do this in maybe 7 minutes. And if you are really interested in this, if you haven't encountered Dabrowski's theory of intensity or overexcitability or sensitivity, I encourage you to kind of dive other ways into it, because it's a super important understanding of gifted from my perspective as a psychologist. So Dabrowski researched creative and then intellectually gifted individuals and found 5 areas. So they are emotional, intellectual, imaginational, psychomotor, and sensual, or sensory is what I use, that may come in higher levels among gifted individuals. They are absolutely present among other individuals in the world. There's not anyone who's saying they're not there, but we just may see them at a higher level among gifted. They're absolutely asynchronous. So you can have a gifted kid who's high on emotional, but kind of average on psychomotor. So it's that asynchronous ability. Emotional intensity is the one that links with anxiety. And so we're going to just talk most about it, and then I'm going to briefly touch on the others. So gifted kids who are emotionally intense have a deep responding to emotions, both internally and around them. So they're frequently kids who can walk into a situation and kind of soak up what is happening, and sometimes soak up everybody in the whole space of what's happening. They have a lot of compassion for others. They have a lot of fears, anxiety, self-examination, self-judgments. They get deep into that emotional life. One of the things that we know about emotionally intense people is that they tend to emote emotions pretty big also. So these are your gifted kids that when they get emotionally dysregulated, they don't dysregulate a little bit, they dysregulate a lot, and they get big. And part of what we know by some brain information right now is that within the brains of gifted individuals, that the amygdala and the emotion processing center of gifted people is larger. So we have some neurological evidence that this is supported by what's happening in the brain and how it is I don't know if it starts that way or if it develops that way. We haven't figured that out with brain research yet, right? But when they're reading and looking at the MRIs, at least that part of the brain of gifted individuals can be bigger. I've heard one presenter say it can be twice as big. The amygdala can be twice as big. I haven't found anything that tells me that it's that much. But that emotional intensity can lead to bigger and stronger emotional responses. And of course, then leading you into fears and anxiety. I'm going to quickly go through the other four because I do think that they come into play when you're an intense person living in the world. Sometimes the world doesn't know what to do with you. And then that can create some internal stress and internal difficulty of like, I don't know how to show up, because when I show up like I think I am normally, people are like not responding well to that. So intellectual intensity is love of learning, like the search for theory, the love of ideas. It's kids who have the capacity for sustained intellectual effort. How I think about intellectually intense kids, it's as if when they're in their area of just pure enjoyment, they are swimming under 10 feet of water. And they are swimming down there inside their brain, and the rest of us are up at the surface. And so what that means is we can be in the same space as them, but they're 10 feet of underwater. So if we say, Tom, I need your attention right now, that frequently does not work under 10 feet of water. And so one of our thoughts as people who work with these gifted intellectually intense is how many senses do you have to engage with that individual to literally pull them up out of the 10 feet of water, which is the deep inside their brain. So do you have to say something? Do you need eye contact? Do you have to touch them? Do you have to be in physical proximity? Do you have to like make them speak back to you? And you know, based on the kids in your classroom, who you have to pull the hardest out once they're deep into that part of their brain. Imaginational intensity is the third, and it is the love of unique, quirky, weird, metaphor, association, unusual, fantasy. So when I think about imaginationally intense gifted people, I think Star Trek, Star Wars, Katniss Everdeen, right? Like these dystopian worlds that gifted people fall so quickly and easily into. Lord of the Rings has been with us forever, right? And gifted people could live in that world forever. So this imagination intensity means that they approach the world with just a desire and need for that. One of the things that you can think about as someone who responds to imaginationally intense people is, where in my space of what I am creating for these people do we allow that fantasy, metaphorical thinking, imaginational play? Where does it come in? Because if I don't give them space for it, they will grab it in whatever way they can. And so designing response so that is there feels very important for these kids. And they respond so well if you let them have some of that unusual in the space and creativity. And I think it's beyond creativity. I really think it's like a push into the unusual for many of them. All right, the last two. Sensory intensity. So this is how the 7 senses respond to the world. We have some pretty good data at this point that gifted people have heightened sensory response systems internally. So what they see, taste, smell, touch, hear, they're proprioceptive and they're interoceptive, how they are in the world. They are overreaders and big responders sensory wise. So the tags on the back of the shirts, what they feel, their response to pleasure, the texture of foods, right? The smell in a classroom. Some gifted kids come into classrooms and are like, what happened in here? Right? Like they're just over responders. But they also respond really well if you utilize senses as part of your learning experiences. So how do we bring in smells and tastes and touch into what we're doing and give them room if they become overwhelmed to like decompress from that oversensory experience? And then the last intensity is psychomotor. So there are some gifted people, and I am one of them, that are just big psychomotor people. They talk with their hands, their mouth moves really fast. They need to move. They're the ones that sit in the back of the classroom and kind of just shake and move and just bounce. And you're like, are you tracking? And one of the ways that we can sort through a little bit of the ADHD versus are you psychomotor intense gifted is, are you tracking? Because an ADHD kid who is in a movement moment has a hard time tracking, and a gifted kid in a movement moment can pretty much tell you what's going on if you ask them a question in the classroom. And so they can do that both. And for some psychomotor intense kids, they actually have to move to learn. Like that is a match for them to come into their brain. Okay, so we're going to just take a brief moment. I don't know what, oh, this is the prairie of Minnesota. So this is, you're now in southwest Minnesota in our prairie land. I don't know if there's any buffalo in this picture, but just to give you a brief moment in Minnesota and ask questions about intensity or anything that I've talked to up until now.
There's a question in the chat for you from
Okay.
Gwen. What is
We call it risky play now instead of just play.
That was before, but Gwen is asking what is the overlap with high sensitive persons? So what is your point of view on that?
Highly sensitive person? You know, it's probably all the same element and we're grabbing a different, like someone's grabbing the ear and someone's grabbing the tail, right? Is probably what I think. I think they're probably everyone who has kind of intense neurological tightness, which is not a neurologist term, but is my term. Because I see one of the things we know about the gifted brain is that there's additional neural firing going on, right? Like there's extra things lighting up when they're thinking math, they light up in other areas. I think there are people in the world, and it's probably gifted, intense, and highly sensitive people that are neurologically tight. They just have a lot of responses as their brain is trying to move itself through information about the world. Whoever asked that, do you want to engage? Is there more that you wonder or more that you want to say?
Hi, I'm Gwen. My English is not so good. That's why I use
your English is much better than my Dutch. So yeah.
Okay. I'm a high sensitive person coach, children coach, and now I am doing an education about gifted children, and I work in primary schools. Yeah.
Okay.
And I see a lot of the similarities between what you say about Dabrowski and the emotional intensities of the high sensitive person. So that's why I was wondering about the overlap, and is what can you say what the difference are? Maybe only intelligence, or yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'll just say this as a jaded psychologist, that there are many, many different psychological realities or characteristics that have been named different things from different people, and we're talking about the same sphere, right? So I think you didn't come to work with gifted by chance if you started from highly sensitive people, because you're like, oh, like it just all flows there, right?
At first I was test anxiety trainer coach, and then I thought, wow, there are a lot of sensitive children who have test anxiety, and then I thought, wow, there are a lot of sensitive children who are gifted. So that's the little bit combination that I'm making now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety, I think.
Yeah.
I'm probably weird, maybe not weird. I'm just not a researcher. So I don't actually care whether it's highly sensitive or intensity. I care about what's showing up in front of me, and can we think about how to respond to that person to make their world be a way that works better for them. And it absolutely has to be world works better for them. It can't be works better for me. And that is unfortunately, in the United States, our education system is set on what works better for me, not what works better for them as a child. And so I think actually in the Netherlands, you guys are doing a better job of thinking child-centered than we are. Maybe.
Yeah,
Maybe said.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm
Yeah,
happy to listen further on. Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. How are we doing? So maybe we take a 5-minute break right now before I jump into a switch. And I'll stay here for like 2 minutes if anybody else has any questions, and then I'm going to walk away for about 3 minutes and come back. So everybody should stand up. If you're thinking you're going to just sit, don't do it. It's bad for your body. Stand up and move.
Exactly. Yeah. So
but I'm going to set a timer. Yeah, I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes for us.
Yeah. So we'll
and I'll
start
stay
again
here for a couple. Yeah.
We'll start again at 57 for everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Am I going too fast?
I don't think so. No, I think this, in my opinion, it's perfect. So, but I'm not the whole public, of course. I think it's
right. But you have a good
a
gauge.
nice,
You know who your
yeah,
people are.
It's a nice space, and there are a lot of people who know a lot of things already. So for them, it's nice to go fast. I think, yeah,
Okay.
they
Great.
can handle this.
Great.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
So I'll take
All right.
my 3-minute break as well.
Perfect. Stand up, move.
And yeah. So it's almost time to start again. And there's a question in the chat for Teresa, so maybe that's a good way to start. I also noticed that we lost a few people. I hope somebody had to leave, unfortunately. And I hope I'll keep an eye on whether somebody wants to get in again. So
Okay.
take it away.
Okay. And it looks like Carla asked about incentives is higher than the quantity of incentives is higher. Ways for gifted and extremely sensitive children to regenerate all those incentives so they can be able to learn again, or at least function and be happy. Yeah, the incentive piece is difficult as we are playing havoc with our dopamine system, right? And this is to some degree what we have done with dopamine is that we have moved from small things gave us dopamine bursts, like, oh, I got a positive response from a friend as we were playing, to that doesn't feel like much in comparison to something that happened on a video game or something that happened in thrill experience or whatever. We keep upping the ante, right? So I'm 56. When I was young, roller coasters looked like one thing, right? And it was thrilling and it was wonderful and our body responded to them, and we were able to see that. And they just have gotten bigger and wilder and more and more and more. And so we're playing havoc with our brains. And so this is a difficult question of like, can we shift back down to, I think this is what it's asking for. Can we shift back down to a smaller level of incentives? And I'm not sure how we're going to do that with everything that is culturally out there that gives incentives. I think it's a cultural question, and it plays itself out in a classroom experience or even a home experience in pretty intense ways. So I hope I answered that. I don't have the response because you're fighting such a big shift of what the brain is looking for excitement and positivity now. So just in reality. All right. Well, we've got one more hour. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about anxiety and interventions and ways to think about it and how to respond. I'm going to try and sit. I may end up having to stand. We'll see how things go as I move forward. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. I think most people know at this point that the anxiety and stress response and the things that happen in the brain come through the amygdala and then go to the rest of the body. One of the things that we are really coming to understand much more clearly about our brains, however, is that our brains are feeling organs that think, not thinking organs that feel. And what that means is when you are taking in all information goes through your feeling system first. And the amygdala is really like a stop guard for what's going to happen next. If you pull in sensory or other information that sets off your feeling sensors in a stress, I need to work on survival, I'm not going to be okay situation, then the amygdala basically stops all function and it doesn't go to the frontal lobe thinking. It goes to a feeling intense response, right? And so one of our things that we're trying to help people do is understand uncomfortable doesn't have to go to I can't handle. That uncomfortable is kind of a first state, and that we then modulate and respond to that to keep the learning open, not shut it down. And one of the messages that has happened in the United States is that this generation of young people in particular have been given a message that uncomfortable is bad, not uncomfortable is normal. Because first, all information has to come through. A lot of it's going to be uncomfortable. And so we get that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn when the amygdala perceives danger and stops. And again, it can be a top down or a bottom up. And fawn is the coming together when you, everyone talks about fight, flight, freeze, but fawn is also, and you should know that they're kind of layered. So when your brain responds in a stress response, you do fight, flight, or fawn first. It's only when you're in a highly stressed response that you do freeze. Okay, so the when I'm really stressed, I go find my friends and I talk to them is a natural response. That's the fawn part, right? The freeze is like a higher level of stress response. And so we come at this, everybody comes out slightly different. And this is, again, why it's difficult in a classroom when you're dealing with anxiety and stress, is that different people will react to the same stressor in different ways, right? So, but I just want to like remind you that fawn is in there, because it is a stress response. Like something just happened and the sounds in the classroom get loud because they're stressed talking, right? This is the reminder that your brain is not designed to promote happiness. Your brain is designed for survival. That is why everything goes through the amygdala first, because we have to assess safety. That is that safety assessment. Am I going to survive this next situation? So we feel, and then the amygdala opens the gate and lets us think and learn, or keeps the gate closed because we're not going to survive, so we don't have to worry about thinking and learning. So to me, this is a really important message when you're thinking about, maybe it's even the incentive, maybe it's people in general. We spend billions of dollars trying to make our brain happy. Billions. And it's because it's not our natural state. And so we're constantly kind of pushing toward that. And so when you're working with kids, know that they want to be in happiness. So they're going to be like seeking that. And when it's the natural state of like assessment, uncomfortable, I just got to get through this, they think something's wrong, rather than this being the natural state of where our brain is at. And so helping them sort through and understand that is one of our kind of changing of messaging that I think we need to do as a society. And there's folks talking about this out there. Our brain also has a negativity bias. So when bad experiences happen, it's like Velcro in the brain. They stick in there very, very, very tight. And when we have good experiences, they kind of float off our brain like Teflon. Right. And they have showed this through all sorts of ways, but just remembering that is why we have the, like, it's every 12 positive to 1 negative. That's why that's in place, because actually that's a brain structure response. And that's why it takes so many positive to balance out that negativity bias of the hold of the bad. The other thing I like for people to remember about the brain is that we have something, and this isn't talked about a lot, but I think it's going to come into conversation a lot in the next 10 years, is we have something called the default mode network. So the default mode network is the part of our brain that is active when we're in wakeful rest, like when we're daydreaming, our mind is wandering, when we're in self-reflection, when we're in mindfulness. It's that the best way I can describe for you to think about your default mode network is that you've been working on a problem and the answer's not coming, and you're active and you're struggling and you're problem solving and frontal lobe cognitive, I'm in there. And then you go take a shower. And somewhere in the shower, your default mode network creates the links, it gets the connections, and you walk out of the shower and go, oh, I know what I should do. That was your default mode network. It uses 20% of our body's energy, and it is an important part. We don't know yet how important it is. But one of the things that we are doing in constantly putting input into the brain is not giving space for that. So when you think about your classroom experiences, if it's all input and there's no time for self-reflection, wandering, daydreaming space, you're not utilizing both parts of your brain. Now, here's the one, this is not anxiety, but this is like a fascinating piece of like how brains work. Folks with ADHD, when they put them in an MRI machine, most of us, when our default mode network turns on, our frontal lobe turns off, and we stop that push for problem solving. And when we're in the problem solving, our default mode network turns off. So they work independently. When they put folks with ADHD into an MRI, they're working at the same time. So the inattention when I'm trying to problem solve might be the push of the default mode network to move you into daydreaming and mind wandering and self-reflection. And they're fighting the fact that their whole brain is turned on rather than part of their brain being turned on. And so the ADHD brain is working super hard to stay in problem solving mode. Because they're constantly being pulled in. And you know that because you've observed them, you've watched them, you've seen them do this. So give space in your own life and give space in the life of the kids that you're working with for that default mode network. Otherwise, our stress goes up, right? Naked exercise and free walking is nothing in your ears. So no podcasts, no music, like nothing in your ears. We just don't do it very much anymore. Okay. Of course, trauma impacts. I'm not going to talk much about trauma. We just don't have time, but I just have to have it in there. Of course, trauma impacts anxiety and stress. Trauma changes the brain, right? What I am going to remind you of is that factors that heal trauma are the factors that are in schools. Close, consistent, positive relationships, rich environments, predictable routines that are conducive to learning, developmentally appropriate, safe, and individualized opportunities to develop new skills, and express emotions. Schools are designed as places that could heal trauma if we hold those things as what we're doing in school. Just want to, like, when we think about stress, to me, that is such a like hopeful thought, that it is all there. We gotta continue to create the environment that it has the possibility of being. But probably for many kids, your school classroom is the most predictable routine that they have in their life. Like you give that to them, you give them that safety. So I'm just reminding you of that. I'm just going to let you know, there is a book out there and there's a TED Talk by this Dr. Elizabeth Stanley about, it's called Widen the Window. And it's a mindfulness and a fitness training. I give you the link. And the reason I give you the link is because as a teacher, you can do this course for free. So there's an online link. It's an 8-week course on building mindfulness. And it can be totally free to you. So if you're like, this is what I should give myself for the new year, it's there. It won't cost you anything. And one of the things I try and do is share as many resources as I can with people. So just know that's there for you if you've been thinking about a mindfulness-based training experience for yourself or your classroom. I also encourage you to go watch this YouTube or this TED Talk at some point about stress. And here's why. When we're thinking about anxiety, and it's stress, anxiety, fear, like they all kind of come together, right? So out here in stress, Kelly McGonigal is a researcher from Stanford, I believe, Harvard, one of those Ivies. And one of her research, what she has found is that when they look at people across time who have a view of stress as helpful, that their cardiovascular system looks more like it's a vascular system in a place of joy and courage. If their view of stress is negative, I think it's the next slide that has the percentage, you have a 43% increased chance of dying. So you can, based upon your perception of what is happening to you in a stressful situation, change how your body interprets what is going on around you. If your perception, that top-down thinking of this stress is, this is bad, it's terrible, it shouldn't be occurring, and you get into a negative spin about it, then your body perceives that as negative and you start a cardiovascular event that moves you toward dying. If you interpret it as positive, like stress happens, we all go through things. This can be overcome. There are ways out. We can move forward. Then your body reads that as courage. And so reframing what's going on in stressful situations makes a really big difference about the long-term impact of what's happening around you. Okay. We talked about resilience. So we're not, I'm going to stop for just a moment and say, any questions? I've just been kind of giving you a big view of what we know about the brain and stress and anxiety. Any questions? Let your brain absorb.
There is a question from Gwen again, and she asked what might be normal for teens in relation to social anxiety. What can you do to help them and also help the parents who might be curling parents? So maybe that's a good time to answer.
So here's another fascinating piece of brain of what's happening. From age about 11, 12 to 16, 17, that part of the brain that is scanning response from the world, like scanning around you to perceive what is coming in, it like doubles. And so when we see teens in this social anxiety moment, like I am worried what everybody else is thinking about me, it is because that part of the brain has turned on super high and super loud from about age 12 to 16, 18. And so, yes, there is a normalcy of social anxiety during that time. Part of what you can do as parents and teachers is help them. So it gets telescoped, right? Like I'm thinking about here, and we can pull back and think broader for them. So helping them not focus in, because particularly gifted kids in social anxiety and all anxiety moments choose the most popular, the most smooth, the most easy, the best grades, right? Their choice of comparison is very high. And so pull back and give them different comparison points. And also we can do some role play with our socially anxious kids about how to make a phone call. None of them like to make phone calls, right? Like, I don't know if any of you are parenting teens, they get so nervous. They get so we can role play phone calls. We can role play. How do you actually step in to a situation? Like, how do you come to the edge of a group and see the pause? So they need a little bit of that teaching in those moments. So reassurance doesn't do a whole lot. They actually need skill building and teaching of how to do it. And so giving them time where you're like, hey, I do. And I encourage you to make them make phone calls. One of my biggest things that I share with people about anxiety, and we're going to see a slide on this in a moment, is that anxiety always comes down. In fact, I'm going to skip over this next section and we're going to go to that slide, I think. Okay, we're going to stop here. Here's an anxiety circle, right? So you have a stress response and all of these things happen to you. So your eyes dilate, your mouth gets kind of dry, your heartbeat goes, you're breathing, all of these things happen. That's the sympathetic system. We also clear anxiety, and the chemicals clear relatively fast. The body response can take a much longer time. So when the chemicals start to clear, they start the process of reversing all of these things. So your pupils come back to normal, your saliva comes back, your heartbeat slows, all of these things. But we link the decrease of anxiety with cognitively what we believe happened to make that anxiety go down. So if we take a socially anxious person and they're anxious about going into a situation, and we say to them, it's okay, you don't have to go, back off, their anxiety is going to come down. And their brain is cognitively going to go, oh, my anxiety came down because I didn't push myself into that social situation. We also, through modeling and support in other ways, can take a socially anxious person whose anxiety goes up, we get them somewhere close or in to the anxiety provoking situation. And as the anxiety comes down, because it will regardless, if their perception is it came down because I went in, and how I think about this is stepping forward. If you step forward into anxiety and you stay until the system recovers and comes down, you now have a way of responding to almost every anxiety by stepping in. Okay. What teachers need to know is that the system, the anxiety system in its recovery has all these behaviors that happen. Right? So let's say you had a classroom stress. I'm going to step away from social anxiety for a second and say you had a classroom stress response. We had just had a fire drill that was unexpected, and we didn't know there was going to be a fire drill. And so everybody's stress goes up. We go outside, and maybe we're outside for 5 minutes. And if we come back into the classroom after only 5 minutes, my bet is a lot of these things. You're going to have giggling. You might have people who are yawning. You might have people who are just like kind of like shaking. Farting is the funniest one because tons of people fart because their whole GI system has been constricted, right? And now it lets go, right? All of these things are that recovery process. And so it looks like kids are goofing around, but what they're actually doing is recovering from a stress response and an anxiety response. So just know that that is part of what happens. We always come down, but we come down in ways that are very like you can observe and see in the behavior. So I jumped away from the social anxiety, but I wanted to like make a point of that. Okay, I'm just going to tell you I did this because we're not going to have time for this. We all need our own positive brain formula of what's our brain health. And so these are the things that research show us. The first 5 are what research shows us need to be there for positive brain health. And then I added personal factors because I think gifted people have a lot of personal factors that help their brain health. So here's my formula. I kind of give this to you as just an example. It doesn't mean that it's the right formula. It's just my formula. And why at least one social thing a week is in there is because I'm so extroverted and I live with all introverts. Like my husband's introverted, my kids are introverted. And if I don't leave the house and do something social, my extroversion needs are going to like explode, right? So I give you guys a, your own, we're not going to take time to do it today, but I'd encourage you to think about your own brain health formula as you are teaching and thinking about the world. So, okay. I also give you, if you are a teacher and you don't have something that is a 45-second timer, I'm going to let this go. This is a 31. This is a singing bowl. And I'm going to talk over top of it. But one of the things that you can do to bring calm to a classroom is use something that there is a predictable lessening. And as the sound goes down, you can ask your classroom that when they stop hearing the sound, it goes longer, they raise their hand. So this is one way to do it. A singing bowl is another. So we're going to transition now into like interventions. And I wanted to get to this sooner, but we've been talking about lots of interventions kind of interwoven. So So before we do that, this is the boundary waters. So I'll give your brain a moment to absorb and ask any questions. So Minnesota is one of the topmost states in the United States. It borders Canada, and the land in between Canada and Minnesota is a protected wilderness that is called the Boundary Waters. You can only go there by canoe. And so this is my family in the Boundary Waters. Well, this is probably like 15, 20 years ago now. So come to Minnesota at some point. It's beautiful. This is my tourist, my tourist pitch for Minnesota. Okay, any questions while your brain is absorbing? Okay. So hang with me. We got about 40 minutes left. So what this last part is going to be is interventions, thoughts about anxiety and stress, and how do you as a teacher interweave some things as preventative measures regarding stress, anxiety, fear response in the classroom, some resources that are out there in the world that might be useful for you, and just ways to think about how do you set up your classroom so that what your kids experience is the amygdala does not need to clamp down and not allow learning, but it can stay open and move from the feeling into the learning part of the brain. Because if the classroom is not safe, they will not learn. Okay. So think about ways to increase calm and transition into calm into a classroom. So one of I love this. I have a teacher who did this, and a teacher who would say, if you can hear my voice, take a deep breath. Just as softly as beautiful. And just keep saying it until every kid in your classroom is just breathing deep. And it's just such a lovely way to transition. Transitioning kids into a space is really important. So this Nature 365 has daily nature videos that are less than a minute in length. And so I'm a nature person. So that's one of the ways that I like really help that. And then we need to, and we've been talking about this whole time, that we need to normalize anxious, stressful feelings as part of our world, not as something that has to be overcome. And so when you're in a learning situation, how do you do that? And help kids talk about, we feel anxious when we're going to take a test. We feel anxious when we come into a new space. We feel anxious. So normalizing stress response and anxiety as part of what happens rather than something that you need to be done with. When you are doing new learning, it is really important to label it as new learning, particularly for your gifted kids, and tell them we're going to have some emotional response to new learning. So saying, this is new learning. I've never taught you this before. I would expect it might be hard and it might be frustrating. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. Then you're going to work for 5 minutes, and then we're going to stop and ask questions. So the work time is really important with new learning because they will have aha moments. And the setting a timer and coming back after 5 minutes is really important because there is a reliability that I am going to respond to what is hard and frustrating with you with information. I'm not going to just let you float out there in that. So really think about how you approach new learning in a classroom situation. Your gifted kids need to know because they're not used to new learning situations a lot of times. I'm trying to think of what's important here. So one of the things I love alarms. So one of the greatest teachers that I know has planned breathing alarms that are told to the kids that they're for her and not for them. So she's a 5th grade teacher, and she tells her kids, so my doctor told me I need to like cut down on my stress. And so I have to stop and take 10 deep breaths every day, 3 times. So I have alarms set for this, right? And she has strategically set the alarms, right, for times that is the most important within her classroom experience, but they have no idea it's for them. Right. And so it is a preventative measure because she knows right around 2:20, we have this like moment of crazy. So around 2:15, her alarm goes off. And so we can prevent and change the flow of what happens. One of the things that makes a difference in lowering stress is time caring for others. So we know this by research, that when you spend time caring for others, your own stress response goes down. So thinking about that in a classroom situation might be an important opportunity for you of like, how do I integrate? How are we going to take care of each other so that we can all work in harmony together? So that is an important kind of thing to put into your thinking about how to respond preventatively with stress and anxiety. And then anything connected with nature. I could get on a broadcast about nature. So sensory walks, even looking out a window, we know what happens in the brain is if you just perceive nature, if you perceive trees, your natural chemical response goes down. Natural lighting inside a classroom rather than those overhead fluorescent lights brings stress levels down of kids. And you probably know this, that if you're going to have like a movie and you turn all the lights off, the kids go, oh, that's so great. Can we keep the lights off? Right? They have that response. So thinking about how do I bring more natural lighting and less fluorescent lighting to lower the stress response in the whole classroom.
Can I ask a question, Teresa?
Yeah. Okay.
According to Gifted Kids and these interventions and nature, what is your point of view on outdoor schools? Do you think that will be helpful for gifted kids in particular? Or?
So it's a really interesting question, right? Because in Japan, they're doing super cool experiments, right? With outdoor schools. I don't know if you've seen them. They're like the greatest. They're like built around trees and they're amazing. However, Waldorf school is a school in the United States. I don't know if it's an international. I think it is, right? Where they are so nature-based that they don't do learning curriculum intervention. And so most gifted kids end up, if it's too far, right, then they end up in a frustration point of like, I thought school was for learning, right? And so to me, it's always like we come into a balance point in the middle. But yeah, I love outdoor opportunity for learning I mean, we're really finding some research on like bare feet on the ground, how important that is for us. I don't know that we can do bare feet on the ground in schools, but there's just a lot of research out there that our brains work much better connected to nature. So, but I do think it needs to be in balance.
Yeah, clear. Thanks.
Yeah. And if you haven't seen the kindergarten in Japan that's built around a tree and the whole roof is a circle, like just go to YouTube and just put that in. It's like you just see the pure joy of these kindergarten students as they are learning in a very integrated way. One of the things I want to give you, I use Amy G. Dalla as the way to refer to the amygdala. If you break it apart, you can see it's actually a name. And so if it has an easy name like Amy, you can shortcut your conversations with kids who you see have that kind of stress response first. And you can say, oh my gosh, Amy just went off. We're going to respond to Amy, not you just got anxious, you just got stressful, you got, right, Amy. And so you've created usually for kids, a funny moment. And what we know about the brain is that in the emotion center of the brain, fear is really, really close to joy. And if we have a true joyful moment where we laugh, it can help suppress the fear response, and the brain can go. So true laughter is a stress reducer and stress preventative. So bringing something like, oh, Amy just went off. We all had an Amy moment, gives it a different spin and allows some of that to come into a situation. The other thing that I want to point out about this slide is that what we know about people who have anxiety disorders, that recovery loop that I talked about, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic response, can be doubled or even tripled in time. So someone who doesn't lean into anxiety can recover in 5 minutes. And someone who has an anxiety disorder can take 10, 15, 20 minutes of recovery time. And this is part of why if you are parenting or teaching someone that you're like, wow, it just takes them forever. Yes. The response to that is yes. It's because that slow recovery is part of the anxiety disorder. It's part of what happens with them. And so they need more time, they need more space, and they need more quiet when they're overcoming something from a fear or worry moment. Okay. So we kind of talked about this. This is what the acute stress response is. We went through this. Okay. We have a half hour. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to jump through this quickly because I imagine most of your schools have, hey, here's what we do if there's an acute stress situation within a classroom. And I'm going to jump to body, behavior, and thought responses that you as teachers can integrate into what you're doing in response to both anxiety and fear within a classroom situation. I want to just highlight 2 things in this. Talk as little as possible until you see recovery behaviors. How I talk to parents about this, and excuse this, but recovery behaviors are when the crazies get out of the eyes. And if you're a parent or a teacher, you know that moment where the stress chemicals have cleared the brain enough that the eyes can now focus again. Because before that moment, anything you really say is not heard at all. Because we're in lockdown. So remember, the amygdala has now stopped any information going to the frontal lobe, any information to go to the word receptors, all of that has stopped. So until recovery starts processing and you see the crazies leave the eyes, say as little as possible. Get close. I think this is the next one. Be low. Keep your body very open and non-judgmental. And once the crazies are out, question, don't command. So a command can possibly re-trigger. I need you to calm down right now. And a kid's going to go, yeah, I do too. Right? But a question of, okay, what can I do to help you in this moment? Is a really different openness rather than, because command comes in and the brain reads it now as a survival push rather than a recovery moment. Okay. As much as possible, you're agreeing, even if you don't agree with what a kid is saying, your head is still nodding. Right. So low affirmations and nodding. So you're doing as much body mirroring of where you want them to be, so those mirror neurons can do their job and come in and they can come down to the calmness of what you need to be. Okay, so we're going to spend our last little bit on interventions for body, for the behaviors, and for thoughts. And I'm going to give you some that you can use in moments of crisis, and some we did some before of like what you can do in preventative. This 4-7-8 and box breathing, those are both YouTube videos that demonstrate that. I want to remind you that we all have a box. our palm is a box in our hand. And box breathing is I breathe in for 4. I hold my breath for a count of 4. I breathe out for a count of 4. And I hold the out for a count of 4. Right? And you can have kids learn to trace on their hands as they box breathe. That's a way to help them carry around a tool with them wherever they go. If you get into like we've started to heighten, there's some sensory responses in our brain that help the whole system calm down. A self massage of the forearms like this, where I'm pulling hard, triggers a calming response. Okay. We can't do this in school, but if you have a kid who goes into a panic attack at home, filling a sink up with water and submerging the face so that the whole face is underwater can help calm the nervous system very, very quickly. So what we can do in schools is a wet towel on the back of the neck, on the hands, or on the face, right? So we're like changing the input of sensory to something that is different. And the water to the face, they don't know quite why, but it tends to shift what's happening with the vagus nerve and the vestibular system, so it moves toward calm. The other thing you can do is teach kids to massage right behind their ears. And we do this naturally in a stress response time, but this stimulates the vagus nerve right back here. This, you probably won't get kids to do this unless they're little. You can also teach them to massage from the inside of their ears forward. And that also stimulates the vagus nerve to calm down. You can get the body to calm in those movement things. I can't stress enough that if you have someone who is in a stress response, movement versus stationary can change long-term trauma. So being constricted when you are in stress can leave the brain in that trapped, I don't know how to get out of this feeling, versus if you are stressed and you move, the brain perceives problem solving. And the best example of this is in the United States on 9/11. There were people who left the center of New York in 2 different ways. There were people who walked out of New York after the Twin Towers were hit, and they walked for miles together in a group. So they're talking to other people, they're interacting, they're sharing, right? But their body is moving. And then there was a group of people who were helicoptered out, not because they were harmed, not because they had any specific harm, but that's just how that group of people got out. And how they helicoptered the most people out is they strapped them to gurneys inside the helicopter, laying down and strapped down for their safety so they wouldn't get hurt in the helicopter. Those people who were strapped down removed more quickly, but not able to move their body, had a long-term PTSD from the 9/11 experience. Those that they studied who walked out had very little PTSD, because what they were looking at is, did the movement and the conversation, the connection, right? So we're flight and we're fawn, both. Did that change how the brain was able to respond to long-term trauma? So in stress response, movement is better. So if I go back to my fire alarm example that I gave you, if you have a fire alarm and your whole class is pretty elevated and they're not in that recovery mode, take a walk around the school. Like just go outside and just do a lap so that you give yourself 20 minutes rather than 10 minutes. Because you're not going to learn in that 10 minutes that they're still in the stress response recovery time. And you all know that because you've all tried to teach before their brains had gotten back regulated. So movement helps regulate faster. All right. I give you within this a this was put together by a group of teachers of ways of moving. So little, big, light, heavy. And they put together this whole, like, here's all different kind of choices that you can make within inside a classroom. And so I just give this to you. So if you have a class of kids that you're always kind of like, how do I get them to move? You can throw this up and they can make choices. And you can make choices. Like sometimes you only want them to do little and light, right? Like play a tiny little violin, but you still want them to like work on moving in their seat or wrist wiggles or so. I love this list. So I'm just sharing it with you. Whoops. Oh my gosh. It should not change. This is an interesting one to shift your brain. We have what's called a quieting reflex that's with us when we're a baby. And if you breathe in and out 2 times, and then you let your jaw drop, like you're yawning on the second breath, it triggers your brain to quiet itself. So that's something you can have a whole classroom of like, and the brain responds to that. So just know that that's a reflex that we have within our brain that you can utilize. Okay. I'm going to talk about some behavior responses, and some of these are in the moment and some of these are preventative. One of the things that high anxiety people do is they do not take risks. They hate risks. And I will tell you the hardest is an introverted, perfectionistic, gifted kid will avoid risk at all costs. So you can think about, is there a way to integrate risk-taking into your classroom experience? The nicest one I've ever heard is a teacher who had a bulletin board, and at the beginning of every month, everyone got a Post-it note and wrote one risk that they wanted to take during that time of that next month. And it could be everything from I want to learn to roller skate to I raise my hand in class because it's the kid that never raises their hand. Depending upon your class makeup, if they're caring and supportive of each other, you can celebrate all the risks and people will feel comfortable putting their names on there. Sometimes people won't, but when a kid does their risk, they can move it either to a done or it comes off or, and as a teacher, please, please, please write down your own risks and do a risk every month with the class. They will celebrate your risk with you so much. And it's a super easy, like, how do we bring in safe space kind of experience into a classroom? There's some pretty good research that if you take 2 minutes before a test, prepping them by doing a couple different things. One, just some breathing exercises would be great, particularly if you have kids that are too young to do writing. But there's been some research that if you take 5 minutes and you say to kids, I just want you to write down everything you're worried about. It doesn't have to be this test. It can be whatever. I want you to write down everything that you're worried about. And then we're going to like basketball hoop it into the trash before we take the test. That now we brought all of their cortisol levels down and their stress levels down, and they're going to think better during the test. So having an opportunity to let go of worry is a really important kind of preparatory thing. And you can say, we're trying to get your brain in its best possible state to respond. That's why we're doing this. I'm not going to look, nobody's going to look, but we want them gone and out before you do something that's going to be hard brain work, like taking a test. I have in here an exercise right here. I'm not going to read it, but I encourage you to go back to it. That it's an example of a teacher who said to his class, tell me what you're feeling at the moment. What are you worried about? And then had some insight into what is actually going on in the classroom of those students. It's a really, again, we create safe, wonderful spaces for our kids. And one of the ways is that we recognize that they carry into the classroom experience things that we have no idea. I have a kid I'm working with that's her stepdad and her older brother were just put in jail for selling drugs, right? And then was supposed to go to math class. It's just hard. It's just hard. Okay. Okay, we talked about these. So let me give you a couple thought response exercises that you can do with whole classes or individuals. Magnifying, mind reading, and personalization. I'm not going to go too deep into those, but I'm going to do the next two. So one of the things that we want to identify for kids today is this useful worry or is it useless worry? So useful worry is the worry that gets us to the like, I'm worried enough that I'm going to hit the top of my outcome, right? I got to have a little stress. I got to have a little bit of push. And so that's a useful worry. Yes, we want useful worry in our word. Useless worry is when we have like magnified it, expanded it out much bigger than it needs to be, or we're triggering on something that is actually like a pretty small thing in the world. And when I am 35, will I remember this is a starting point for a kid in a like moving to a useless worry. When you're 35, will you remember? Oh no, probably not. How about when you're 25? How about when you're 17? How about next week? Right? So we've got to bring them down the steps because they do initially think that they are going to be worried about this when they're 35, right? But there's very few things from our elementary age that we actually did that we are worried about when we're 35, right? And most things we're not worried about next week. So helping them walk backwards from, is it useful or useless worry? And then this is one of my favorites. Best, worst, middle prediction exercise is recognizing anxiety and worry for what it actually is, which is always a worse prediction, right? Anxiety starts us from a worse possibility place. So this came up with a fourth grader, the same fourth grader who gave me unrelenting forethought, actually. We did this exercise and I've used it with tons and tons and tons of kids and whole classrooms. This kid came in and said, I don't want to go camping. And I'm like, why don't you want to go camping? And we got there and he said, well, I am worried that my whole family is going to be standing on the edge of Lake Superior and the cliff is going to fall away and my whole family is going to fall into Lake Superior and die. And I went, of course you don't want to go camping, right? That's the worst thing that I could imagine happening on a camping trip ever. So validate the worst, because that's never going to happen. That is the worst thing I could imagine happening, right? Validate the worst. And then with people who are anxious, or many people, they live between worst and possibly middle. They never come all the way over to best case scenario thinking. So part of our interventions with them can be helping them go from what is the worst thing to what is the best thing that you can imagine happening from this situation. What will happen when you do it with a classroom or with an individual is first they'll push up just a little bit from the worst to the middle and they'll say, we're going to go camping and we're going to like roast marshmallows. And like, no, that is not the best. The best needs to be the same distance from most likely as the worst is. Right. And so now we're stuck a little with this fourth grader of like, is there a best that's equal to my family dying on a cliff in Lake Superior? And what we came up with after like iterations, right, is he said, okay, my family goes on a camping trip. There is a scout from Disney and he sees my family and he casts my family in a Disney movie. We go to California, we star in a Disney movie, and then we get to go to Disney for as much as we want. I was like, okay, for a fourth grader, that's equal, right? Then you come back to middle, right? But it won't work with an anxious person unless you push them all the way to best. Okay, so then you come back to middle. What's probably going to happen? Well, probably we're going to have some tent sleeping and some campfire and some bugs and swimming in the lake if it's warm enough and all of that. You can do this same thing with the whole class. We have a fourth chapter math test coming up. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? And I'll do this from another anxiety kid. I literally had a kid who, a junior in high school, who said, I'm going to be homeless on the street if I don't pass this math test. And we're like, okay, whoa, wait, it's like your chapter 4 math test. How are you homeless on the street? What anxiety does is it goes, I don't pass the 4th chapter math test. I don't pass junior math. That means I actually won't graduate. If I don't graduate, I won't go to college. If I don't go to college, I won't get a good job. If I don't get a good job, I won't have a house. If I don't have a house, I'm going to be homeless under a bridge. 3 seconds. Right? So you're going to be homeless under a bridge. What's the best? Oh, actually, this chapter 4 math test, Stanford is using it as an entrance exam to get a full ride scholarship to Stanford. And so if I pass this chapter 4 math test, I get to go to college 4 years for free. Then we come back to the middle. What's probably going to happen, right? So we can help move anxious thinking so we don't trigger that fear response. We can help them see that their thinking is off balance. And the biggest part of this one, and this is all anxiety, is helping, how far away are you from most likely without insulting them? Okay. Label anticipatory anxiety. So anticipatory anxiety is, for almost all of us, before we do something we've never done before, we get anticipatory anxiety about what it's going to be like. That's normal. That doesn't mean not do it. That doesn't mean stop, I can't do it. That's a normal thing. So help them see, oh, you've never played soccer before and you're going to go to your first soccer practice? Yeah, you have anticipatory anxiety. Of course you do. What are you thinking about? What do you think is going to happen at that soccer practice? I bet you can't even picture anything except for that no one talks to you and it's going to be terrible and you're going to suck at soccer, right? Now you've opened up a conversation, right? And a whole class can have anticipatory anxiety about upcoming finals, upcoming situations. They actually have anticipatory anxiety sometimes about upcoming holidays, right? Because they don't know what it's quite going to be like. So labeling that and helping people, again, normalize, of course you're worried. Let's now figure out what to do about the worry. How do you change what your thought pattern is in response to that upcoming situation? And then the last kind of intervention is, if people are in a feeling state, sometimes we can shift their emotional state by moving them to a thinking state. And that's why you have the interventions of count backwards by 7, right? Do 5 math problems. Give me all your Spanish verbs you're working on, right? So move them from feeling to thinking. And if it's a small enough, like feeling stuck, the thinking will help shift the brain from there. Okay, we saw
have
that.
5 more minutes,
Yeah.
Teresa.
5 more minutes. Oh, perfect. Perfect. So basically what's left in here are resources for you. This is a lovely video called Just Breathe, and it's kids talking about taking deep breaths, and it's like a magic ball with all the like fairy things falling down. It's a lovely little video. This is a whole series. Julia Cook has a lovely series on emotions that can be used in a classroom experience. One of these is her reading the books. So if you're not like a big reader of books in the class, this is that. This is if you have like big, huge meltdowns going on in your classroom. This is an approach to meltdowns using what they call the SCARED technique, helping kids feel safe, calm, affirmed, moving to routine, empathy, and then developing strategies. So I like it because it first recognizes in the meltdown that I don't feel safe, I don't feel calm, right? That's what triggers a meltdown. Free Spirit Press, which is here in Minnesota, has a whole series of books written for kids. So what to do when you're scared and worried or cranky and blue. I really like these if you're looking for resources for kids in your classroom. These are 2 resources. Anxiety Free Kids is my favorite book about anxiety because Bonnie Zucker wrote 2 books and put it into one. The first half is written for parents. So it talks about anxiety from a parent perspective. And the second half is written for kids. And you book group the chapters together. So parents and then able to talk about them coming from their own increased knowledge. Eli Leibowitz is a researcher at Harvard at the Center for Emotional Health. And he has written a book called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. He wrote a program just for parents. He was trying to figure out a way to do therapy of how parents could change what they were doing to change kids' anxiety, and has put it into a book. And I think it's very well researched. It's very well done. And there's some good, solid things for parents to do. Particularly if they can't get their kids to kind of shift, like understanding how they are adding into the anxiety. Some more resources. This is a great website, anxietyintheclassroom.org. Tons of interventions, tons of way to think about things, tons of way to get in there. If you're looking for mindfulness, this Mind Up curriculum, love it. And then I just give you some like, hey, I kind of need some signs for my classroom. So here's just some things that you could integrate if you've got a class full of kids that need to like do something different when they get into that high response situation. Oh, and this is the Boundary Waters again. And I think this is it. I think so. Questions that people may have, like, boom, sorry, I talked so fast and so much came at you. Any last follow-up questions or thoughts or needs?
Anyone?
Hi, I have a question. I was just I'm gonna be it's not really a question. I was just thinking about something you said, and or I have this feeling, or you know, that maybe we should.
Daphne,
Ja?
je bent slecht te verstaan. Kun je iets
Oh.
duidelijker?
Should I put it in the chat real fast? Then
Yeah.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, probably Daphne will put her question in the chat because it's not very well
Okay.
coming through.
Yeah, I couldn't hear. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
right.
she's putting it in the chat right now. And
and I do know people have to leave because you guys should be going home to your families. So I do appreciate your time in the afternoon there. So thank you for being a lovely audience, and I'll watch for this question to come up in the chat. I'm glad people learned. I hope that the like all the little practical things are useful. That's my like. I want people to understand, and then I want people to be able to have things to do.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well. That's very, very wonderful. It's not only the theory, but also the practical tips that you gave us. And I'm glad that all the people are very enthusiastic. And now we have the question of Daphne.
Yeah, and Daphne, I 100% agree with you. I think gifted people, this is why I brought up that idea of unrelenting forethought. I think that is how the gifted brain operates, that it's kind of always trying to problem solve. And when you're always trying to problem solve, you always see the problems. And when you see the problems, you get stressed and anxious about them. And so I agree. It feels like a default state. And maybe that's part of our job working with these gifted people to shift their labeling of what is happening, that it's not necessarily that they're creating anxious experiences. They're thinking through problems. They have this unrelenting forethought. Unrelenting forethought is easier for us to absorb as a person than you always are doing worst case scenario. Like, and worst case scenario, most people have anxiety are like, yeah, because if you don't, you're in trouble. I think the same is true for unrelenting forethought. So, yeah, and so I totally 100% agree with you, Daphne. Yeah, we need good translations for unrelenting forethought. And
we'll think about that, Daphne. That's true. That's
okay.
That's a good one. How can we say that in Dutch? Because that's something that really resonates.
Right, but it might be missing by word usage. Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for your time and your energy, Teresa.
Thank you all. Yep, I appreciate. Yeah. Okay.
So,
and I'm sorry I talked so fast, everyone.
No, that was perfectly fine. I think there was no problem. Bye. Thank you so much.
Good. Yep.
So this is the end. Thank you, everybody, and see you later.
Yeah. Do you need anything from me? Do you know?
No, I don't think I need anything from you. I think what I need is the slideshow, but we have it, so we can. Yeah.
Great. Great.
And if I need anything else, I'll let you know. Thank you so much. It must have been exhausting for you as well.
This is how I go all the time, just like full speed ahead. So
yeah, but I think most all the people who were there were listening very carefully and were really,
good.
there.
Good.
So
good.
I think it was a
I
good
hope
session.
it's useful.
Yeah, I think it was. And thank you so much, and have a nice day. And maybe we'll see each other later.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.